In this symposium on imminent fracture risk, we explored the concept of how being at high risk of fracture might relate to the time course of a subsequent fracture. And of course, and I think most importantly, if somebody has been found to be at high risk of fracture, and that might be, for example, because they have very low BMD, they have multiple risk factors, then they are going to be at high risk of fracture tomorrow, the next day, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. And the take-home message is that one needs to get on and treat people when they've been found to be at high risk of fracture. But in this symposium, we also explored the concept of particular risk factors which might act over particular periods of time. And of course, if one can address those issues and identify particular risk factors which act over those specific periods of time, then that might help guide therapy and indeed the choice of therapy, and whether that might be pharmacological or attributes such as falls risk, for example. So this concept of imminent risk can be taken to address immediate risk of fracture, but also a risk of fracture which is raised particularly high in the near future, but which then wanes with time. And this risk pattern has been best characterised for fracture itself. And so from data originally from Sweden and then from Manitoba, and most recently from our work on the Reykjavik study, it's been established that if you have a fragility fracture, then your risk of a further fragility fracture is very raised immediately afterwards, and particularly over the first 2 years or so, but then wanes over that time and to reach a plateau thereafter, but still higher than that of the general population. So a fracture is associated with an immediate rise in the risk of a subsequent fracture, which then declines with time. And so that is a particular risk factor that might suggest that if it happens, you need to get in there, assess and treat urgently. And you can imagine how having a fracture might lead to increased fracture risk in the immediate aftermath because of reduced mobility, reduced weight bearing, analgesics which might affect stability and falls propensity. But then as things heal up and you come off medications, things improve with time. And so to conclude, for fracture itself, there's good evidence that there's increased fracture risk immediately afterwards, which then decreases with time but remains high compared with the non-fracture population. But most importantly, if somebody is found to be at high risk of fracture, then they are at high risk of fracture tomorrow, the next day, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, and therefore, if one is found to be at high risk of fracture, then treatment should be started immediately. And particular events, such as a new fracture, should be a real stimulus for assessment and treatment.